Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. Hopefully you all are having a wonderful day today. And thank you so much for tuning in to another weather video. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the severe weather threat that is expected to impact portions of central Illinois and Indiana. Now, there are a lot of questions in relation to this severe weather outlook, quite a bit of uncertainty with this one. Sort of like what we saw in Michigan and Ohio yesterday, where there were some questions with initiation. I would actually argue that today's threat might be a little bit more questionable from what we even saw yesterday across the Ohio Valley, Michigan. And by the way, we saw a lot in the way of severe weather for that region. Quite a bit of damaging wind reports, even a couple of tornadoes that had touched down in Michigan. So, of course, our thoughts go out to those that were impacted by those storms. So today's severe threat, in contrast to yesterday, is going to be a little bit more questionable. We'll break all that down for you in today's video. The one thing I wanted to mention for a programming reminder is that I was going to originally talk about the tropics today. I have actually pushed that back into this weekend. And the reason why is at the moment there really isn't an immediate threat of landfall for any of the tropical systems we're seeing either in the Atlantic or the Gulf. We certainly have to revisit that, though, as we get into next week when we start to see some more development and get better model guidance on the placement and the development of some of these systems. We're particularly concerned, at least going into next week, about the potential impacts of a system that might develop out towards the Caribbean and eventually move into the Panhandle. I know there's been a lot of reporting about that, if you've seen it on Twitter or YouTube or even the National Hurricane Center. The one thing I'm going to mention to you guys is, at least for our channel, I don't want to spend too much time on a system that still has a lot in the way of development to go going into next week. But as we get into the weekend and really look at next week, then we'll sort of dive in and take more of a broader look and kind of really get into the weeds of it too, with the development, the placement, and all the factors that go into that. So I don't want you guys to think that we are completely neglecting the tropics today, or let alone just forever. We are going to be talking about the tropics as we get into this weekend and as I've already said, really dive deep into that. But in the immediate term, we're going to talk a bit about the severe threat as well as some other weather trends that we're noticing. So if you do enjoy today's video, be sure to like and subscribe, share with family and friends. And with that all said, let's get into today's video. All right, so we're going to start first with the latest hazard map across the country. And if there's any good news is that I was about to say red flag warnings. These excessive heat warnings have somewhat retreated to the south, but unfortunately for folks in the south central United States, in the Gulf of Mexico, and even for my friends in central Illinois and Missouri and Iowa, you guys will continue to deal with the heat, at least in the immediate term. For Illinois and Iowa and Missouri, do expect for this ridge to continue to retreat back into the south central U.S. So for my friends in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, it will continue to remain hot here for the foreseeable future, as we talked about. But you should, for folks in the lower Great Lakes, expect to see this ridge of high pressure continue to retreat. And if I was to draw out sort of our jet stream at the moment, it sort of would go like this, right? You have this ridge of high pressure that extends all the way into central Illinois and then back towards the Gulf Coast states. So this, however, was actually more so to the east and northeast yesterday, which is what caused a lot of that severe weather in Michigan and Ohio. But again, this is retreating back to the southwest, so we are starting to see these excessive heat warnings meander back to the south central section of the United States. We also do have an excessive heat watch that encompasses Arizona as well as southeastern California. Now, this actually doesn't go into effect until right around late this weekend and early next week, and that's because our jet stream pattern is going to go through a transition to where instead of this sort of ridge being in much of the central United States, we're actually going to see more of a ridge trough pattern going into next week. So that certainly would mean sort of a return to what we saw back around, June, July, where a lot of our heat was parked right around the southwestern U.S. Unfortunately, though, this hot air extends all the way into Texas and Oklahoma, so you may see some slight relief with that, but it still is going to be well above average for you folks in Texas and Oklahoma. Just because this ridge retreats to the west doesn't mean that you guys are going to be out of the woods. It will still be very hot going into next week. But those excessive heat watches are for late this weekend and early next week, and that is going to be for that ridge as it builds back into the southwestern, even northwest for, again, early next week. We don't have any excessive heat watches yet for the Pacific Northwest, but would not be surprised to see your temperatures warm up as well as we see that ridge build during that period. We also do have an area of flash flooding to worry about for the Rockies. If you guys remember from yesterday, we had in the four corner states some flash flood warnings in effect, and that was due to the remnants of what was Tropical Storm Harold that was really just spitting out precipitation. We're still seeing that being the case across the Rockies. It's just moved a little bit more north. So this is really the remnants of what was Tropical Storm Harold that is now impacting Colorado and even some portions of extreme southwestern Nebraska and Wyoming. So certainly can expect to see some pretty nice precipitation totals out of that. You also do have this Gulf Stream moisture that's feeding into it, as well as even a slight Pacific jet component. So there's a lot of moisture to go around. Could see some heavy rainfall rates at times, and because we're talking about higher elevations, could see some runoff as well. And for the rest of us, can't go without saying we do have heat advisories, so I don't want to take away from the fact that it isn't hot in areas east of the excessive heat warnings. You certainly are dealing with some very hot temperatures across Georgia and even getting into Alabama and Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio. So we certainly have a lot in the way of the heat, and that really does encompass our hot air dome that's pretty much parked itself over the last few days in this part of the country. Here's what we got for severe weather outlook. We have a 15% slight risk that is from central Illinois back into Indiana, and it's a very small slight risk area. So central Illinois getting into, say, portions of Indianapolis and points southward. And gotta be honest with you, this risk is very small in comparison to what we saw yesterday with our enhanced risk for Michigan and Ohio. Now, the risk today, we aren't expecting anything in the way of a tornado. It's a non-zero chance. Our main threat is going to be damaging winds with a 15%, pretty much draped across the same region that's under the slight risk, encompassing localities like Bloomington, Peoria, and then moving eastward downstream into portions of Indianapolis and the Indianapolis suburbs, even in Bloomington, Indiana as well. And then if we look at our hail potential, there is a 2% risk. And by the way, there also is a severe risk for the UP of Michigan, as well as some of the central plains of Kansas and then eastern Colorado. This severe threat really is an association with the remnants of Tropical Storm Harold. Be interesting to see how that pans out. May even see an MCV develop out of this, so we'll have to keep a close eye on that setup too. But our primary threat really is going to be central Illinois and Indiana. Again, 2% chance of hail. We are expected to see some pretty high lapse rates today at the surface and even some decent mid-level lapse rates. So there is a 2% chance, but it's really going to come down to what convection we see later on today. There's a lot of questions with initiation for this setup. Let's start first with a sounding of this morning. This was taken from ILX. This is the Lincoln, Illinois sounding. And this was from this morning, 12Z. And a couple of things that I want to point out to you. First of all, just like yesterday with what we saw in Michigan in the morning, very stout thermodynamic profile. So we're talking about most unstable CAPE being 4,000. You also have mixed layer CAPE as of this morning being 3,600. With forecasted surface being 5,200. So there is a huge, very well-defined instability profile. I mentioned the word Cape tongue. You can certainly see that demarcated here by this dotted line from the LFC all the way up to your equilibrium level. So a lot of instability sort of aloft here as we, sort of go above, say, 850 or 1 kilometer. Your LCL is also slightly elevated, but you have a very unstable mix layer. So if you get enough mixing and enough sort of lift to sort of enhance that mixing or force that mixing, you certainly can be dealing with some rapid intensification of some storms. Now, here's the deal with that though. We have the instability, right? We have very steep lapse rates, 9.0 from this morning, as well as some nice mid-level lapse rates as well. The instability is there. But the question is two things. What is going to be your lifting source? That's number one. And number two, what's going to be the storm mode? Take a look at your hodograph, right? And our hodograph does a phenomenal job at depicting what the storm mode will be, as well as even the storm motion. Guys, if I could describe this hodograph, it would be as if you gave a 5-year-old a box of crayons and you just let them draw anything on a picture, right? You remember how as a kid you had to color within the lines and you were always told that you can't color outside of the lines? I don't know if that was you, but I mean, I know that was me. My parents were so strict about that. Well, think of that with the hodograph, right? That is like if I took a crayon and was just drawing all over a page. It is such a mess to really comprehend. This isn't anything in the means of, you know, cyclical shape that we might see with like a supercell. If you can remember, by the way, these supercells and hodographs, you can usually see really nice looping or low-level veering and then some backed flow aloft. Well, we certainly do have backed winds aloft. I mean, by your wind barbs, you have really nice northwesterly flow, pretty modest, I would say. And then as you get down, it's pretty much westerly, and then towards the surface, it's out of the north. So what the hodograph is reflecting is, in terms of what kind of storms we could see today, even if there were ones that initiated, guys, these are going to be a multi-clustered mess, all right? There's a ton of instability we're working with, but the problem is you're forcing aloft and what your lifting component's going to be. What we can expect later on today is for a little bit of a convergent boundary to set up across central Illinois and for some initiation to take place. The models are doing sort of a rough job at, you know, showing the instability really coming into shape and any capping inversion being mixed out. But what I would say is I think there should be enough forcing to initiate convection. However, unlike what we saw yesterday, I personally don't expect to see anything in the way of cyclically shaped supercells or really nice veering profiles. This is going to be more so of a convergent boundary setup as opposed to one that's just really warm frontal. So a little bit of a different storm mode, different circumstances here, same thermodynamic profile in terms of our instability, but more questions remain with our lifting source, which might be a convergent boundary, could also be maybe an outflow boundary, as well as really what storm mode and what that's going to look like. Because at the moment, at least based on our morning soundings, this is going to be more of a multi-clustered setup as opposed to one with supercells and semi-discrete cells. That means big implications for our severe threat. So if we're seeing more of a multi-clustered threat today, then we could be talking more about, say, damaging winds and maybe some hail. But if we were talking about maybe a supercell setup, which is, I don't think, going to be the case today, then there would be certainly a chance at tornadoes like we saw yesterday. But like I said before, I think the threat today is really going to be damaging winds with any storms that do grow upscale and that tap into this mix layer, which is incredibly unstable, help to mix down any winds aloft and then produce some downbursts or some strong winds, as well as even some hail in spots. You do have some steep lapse rates, but the storm mode for that may or may not be very much supportive of that. I would still say there is a hail threat, but really the threat today is going to be hail and damaging winds. All diatribes aside, let's go ahead and move forward. This right here is a surface frontogenesis map from the Storm Prediction Center. Credit goes to them on this. And I wanted to pull this because, at least from the surface getting up into 850, when we're looking at the development of a front, it really is important to look at that to see what type of boundary we're working with. You can notice right out of the gate that you have this southwesterly flow component coming up from this mid-level ridge that's residing over the southern half of the U.S., just like we talked about, right? You also, though, have this easterly wind coming out of the northeast. So it's sort of a east-northeast wind. What we're expecting later on today is we do have a shortwave trough to the north that is going to eventually dig down. Now, it's not going to dig in any way of like a negative tilt. It's going to be more positively tilted. And we're not really going to see a lot of that get tapped into central Illinois. But we should actually see maybe just a little bit of some divergence aloft to where we get a little bit of some surface level convergence and produce some multi-clustered convection somewhere within this area. At least as of the time of this map, the only thing that we have going on at the moment is sort of a southwesterly component. We have already very warm temperatures and very high dew points in this area. Central Illinois at the moment is seeing temperatures closing in on 90 with dew points well into the 70s. So we certainly do have moist air advection in this area. But the problem is you don't really have much forcing or lifting, right? You don't have much of a cold front here. I mean, you do have a northeasterly component, but it's not really directly out of the north. We don't have much of a northerly forcing component just yet. We are anticipating, though, that that's going to change later on this evening as we start to see some of that cold air sink down in association with that shortwave trough coming out of Canada. So that may help to initiate some of that convection and provide sort of a convergent boundary. But again, the problem is with that setup or that sort of thinking is that the models are having a very difficult time picking that up. We're going to show the models here in a second on some of the latest thinking on the weather models, but it's really doing a tough job and a difficult job at really depicting that. So there still are a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainty with that forecast. But keep in mind that that certainly is a scenario that could pan out. We're just not going to see a lot of that forcing. There might be enough to initiate some multi-clustered cells later on this evening, but it's not going to be that vigorous motion or that lift that we saw yesterday in the areas that we've already outlined. Now, if we move forward, though, take a look at your CAPE profile. Keep in mind this is surface-based CAPE. Nonetheless, though, your cap is eroded from the surface, and even it's starting to erode throughout our boundary layer. 6,000 surface level CAPE in central Illinois right now. I mentioned the models are doing a tough time at resolving things. Speaking of that, they are doing a tough job, not even a tough job, that's the wrong wording. I would say they're doing a bad job at correcting themselves with regards to the erosion of this cap. Some of the models like the HRRR and the RAP are showing this cap inversion still in place. And the reality is it's already been mixed out earlier than anticipated. So the instability axis is alive and well across central Illinois and even getting into southern Indiana and central Indiana. So they're sort of behind a couple of time steps with that. That's certainly concerning to me as far as forecast confidence is concerned, because these models really are having a tough time correcting that. And they need to correct that in order to resolve convection later on tonight. So just to recap, let's sort of back up for a second, all right? We are seeing the models sort of in disagreement on what will pan out later. I'm going to show that in a second. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but they're having a tough job at picking up convection for today. The other issue that's happening right now is they're having a really difficult time in resolving the instability axis. Many of the models, the convective allowing models, are still showing this area pretty capped off at the moment, and that's not in touch with reality. We're already seeing this cap pretty much eroded in central Illinois and Indiana. So this atmosphere is very much primed for convective initiation. The only component we're missing is some form of lift, whether that be an outflow boundary that comes off from one of these areas of showers across northern Illinois later on today, or a convergent boundary that sets up later on this evening. So just wanted to back up for a second and let you guys know that's where the thinking is right now. I threw a lot your way in the first 15 minutes of the video, but I wanted to just go ahead and clarify that for you guys. As we go forward, though, speaking of the weather models, here's the HRRR 15Z, and you can see that a lot of your convection really doesn't fire off until later on this evening. The HRRR's interpretation on this one shows showers and thunderstorms initiating in east central Illinois before diving southeast through Indianapolis and then eventually into the Ohio Valley region. This actually does depict more of a bowing segment. So because you have a lot of mixed layer CAPE and as well as downdraft CAPE, you are going to produce, once again, a lot of cold pooling and may get some bowing segments within what could potentially be an MCS complex later on tonight. But, you know, again, the placement of these storms and the timing of that is still very much in question because, as we just mentioned, the HRRR is doing a pretty bad job at resolving what's happening right now, what we call nowcasting. So this is certainly still in question. I will say, though, that the RAP is also showing something very similar, but the only difference between the RAP and the HRRR is that you are seeing convection back into central Illinois, and I certainly do anticipate this happening if we can get sort of a convergent boundary to set up. And as you can see on the RAP, you have these northerly vectors and then southerly vectors. When they sort of touch each other from tip to tip, essentially, you do get sort of a convergent boundary demarcation to set up. So that's where you're seeing sort of that shower and thunderstorm activity develop. Again, the HRRR is showing that more to the east, which would miss central Illinois completely. But as you can tell, there's a lot of questions with initiation here. So just to kind of conclude things for today, we certainly have instability. We have the moisture. We have the very well-defined thermodynamic profiles in this area with CAPE and downdraft CAPE and mixed layer CAPE, all of those metrics. We also do have even some decent shear. Not as impressive, bulk shear is probably going to be around 20 to 30 knots, still enough to produce some multi-cluster convection, but not high enough values to produce any sort of supercells that we might see, with some of those more severe setups with bulk shear values being typically 50 to 60 knots for supercell development. So to recap everything, a lot of disagreement with the models in terms of resolving the current trends as it is right now, as well as how these storms are going to initiate. Is it going to be a convergent boundary or is it going to be an outflow boundary? Or is it going to be both, right? And also where these storms will hit. We certainly expect that any initiation for thunderstorms will be within probably the 4 to 8 o'clock time frame for Indiana and Illinois in this area highlighted. But again, there's still a lot of questions here as far as who will get the worst impacts. Do I think we will see severe weather tonight? I personally think so. I think there is enough in the way of some small perturbations with outflow boundaries and convergent boundaries to set up to where you can get enough of that lift to produce convection. It's just going to be more of a multi-clustered convection mess. I'm not expecting discrete cells, more of an MCS complex as we get into later this evening. Anyway, I hope you guys did enjoy this video, and as I mentioned at the top of the video, be sure to like, subscribe, share with family and friends, and we will see you here on the next video. Take care.